The French Revolution and English or rather European Romanticism more or less emerged during the same period. And English Romanticism or British Romanticism has been heavily influenced by French Revolution. This is quite because important to highlight this because often in our discussion of romanticism we restrict ourselves to return to nature as the marker of romanticism or return to past medievalism and other things or reaction to the enlightenment or age of reason issue. But all this are there. Romanticism in a way is a multifaceted movement, but possibly we undermine or we do not address the most immediate origin of romanticism, which is the French Revolution. Before going to the effects of romanticism on French Revolution or rather the influence of French Revolution on Romanticism, I would like to have a brief sketch of the French Revolution here. This started as a fallout of a meeting that was called a meeting of the three estates of the French political system, then the aristocracy, the clergy, and the third estate, which is the commoners. Now, all these were known as estates. So, they were called for a meeting to address some urgent financial needs and to usher in financial reforms in the month of May in the year 1789, specifically 5th May 1789. So May is very important for revolution. So when 1st May is the uh, day, International Labor Day. Anyway, now, after the meeting, in the struggle or squabble that followed, the third estate actually became victorious. The commoners became victorious over the other two segments. And they met defying the king in a tennis court and said that they will not move away unless and until they gave France a new constitution, the commoners, that is. So it is like the movements or agitations as we have today in Delhi, often in Jantar Mantar or Ramlila Maidan. I am using these examples because this is meant for Indian students basically. So the king Louis the 16th actually he agreed, but he was not very keen on being guided by the common class, but he had no other option and he agreed, and a new constituent assembly was drafted where the other two classes, higher classes, that is the aristocracy and the nobility, had to work in collaboration with the working class. However, later the king retracted from his position. He opposed this, and that led to the rather the climax in the revolution. On 14 July 1789, the common people of Paris seized the prison which was very famous or infamous, Bastille, which has become a trope almost, the siege of Bastille, a trope of revolutionary achievement. And the National Constituent Assembly declared that the feudalism has come to an end on 4th August. Bastille was seized on 14 July and 4th August the declaration came. It also declared the rights of man and the citizen on 26th August, which are often known to all, the very ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which were the common slogan of French Revolution, and that it is important not only for France and England but also for the entire world. Our basic ideas regarding universal human rights come in an organized form from the French Revolution only. Now, The assembly then led to a monarchy, a regime which will be a monarchical regime, but where legislative and executive powers should be shared by the king and an assembly, just as we have in India today or elsewhere. A president or a prime minister at the helm of affairs, who is a kind of quasi or proto king, though officially monarchy has ended, and the parliament actually represents the common people, basically the lower house of the parliament. Though we call it the lower house, that is Lok Sabha is basically all powerful, the upper house has no power. So all these are the legacies of French Revolution. So it is in our own interest that we should try to know more on this or about this. Now, in the details, you must have noticed one thing, that what figures prominently, even if you forget the other facts and figures, which you should not, but what figures prominently is the rise of the working class. Well before Karl Marx, working class or common people, let us say. So they actually held the sway in French Revolution. So in 1789, if we take the 14 July 1789 as the pinnacle of French Revolution, then if you just transpose these two digits 89, then you get 1798, which is the official beginning of Romanticism in England. 1798, the lyrical ballads were published. Now, prior to French Revolution, literature in general and poetry in particular was basically about the aristocracy. There are a few exceptions like Pliers the Plowman or Pilgrim's Progress, but by and large, say 18th century literature or Shakespeare, say Elizabethan literature, Restoration literature, they are basically about whom? Monarchy or the royal class. Now, Romanticism was fortified by the belief of the French movement that the life of the commoners is as important as, or rather more important than, the life of aristocracy. So, you see Wordsworth writing poems on, you know, as humble a person as a leech gatherer, or Coleridge writing the Ancient Mariner on a very common sailor, not even a captain or sorts. So, very common sailor. And all these indicate that the French Revolution had heavily influenced the Romantics, and which is only natural. Apart from that, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, and Shelley, all these at least have openly welcomed the changes brought in by French Revolution and the revolution itself, though their individual response obviously were a bit variegated response to the revolution. Now, the romantic movement, in a way it is also a movement. Why do we call it a movement? Romantic movement. So French Revolution is a movement, so romantic movement is also a movement. We do not call the Augustan movement Augustan age Augustan movement, or we do not call the Victorian age the Victorian movement, but the romantic age is also called the romantic movement because it was influenced by the ideas of revolution, which basically came from the French Revolution. And now if we take a close look at some of the individual cases in French Revolution, then we'll again see that of all revolutionary poets, Shelley was the greatest revolutionary. In a way, Shelley's revolutionary zeal was also individual. He was independently of an independent mind, even without reference to French Revolution as well. And he was, as has been mentioned by a critic who has compiled a very, very, very important book on this issue that we are discussing, Alfred Hancock. He has written a book called The French Revolution and the English Poets. colon a study in historical criticism. There, he has said that Shelley was, I quote, in spite of all his lovable and general traits, he was a born disturber of the public peace. Even in his college days, just remember, it was basically, it was a period long before Darwin, and even in a way, not to speak of Darwin, Marx, and others, it was basically just the early 19th century. But he had written also a poem called, an essay called "The Need for Atheism," for which he was banished from Oxford. Shelley. So his epithet was the Mad Shelley. People used to call him, because all who are revolutionary are, in public perception, will be treated as mad, because otherwise who will want to take the trouble of disturbing authority, questioning authority? One would be happy with one's job, income, pleasure, merrymaking, etc., while serving the authority. That is the common perception. So that is why, Shelley was called Mad Shelley. Similarly, Byron's Child Harold, or the typical Byronic hero, they are always at odds with society, the established social order. You may see this as even erotic profligacies, but that is just one point of view. I would rather contend that the erotic profligacies or libidinal profligacies in Byron are not erotic or libidinal profligacies per se, but they are modes of protest against established norms and orders of the society. Here, Byron has a great parallel in Marquis de Sade, so from whom we have sadism, sodomy, all these terms. So he is a very important figure and influenced people like Edward Said and Michel Foucault and even Derrida. Byron had in fact categorically stated that, I quote, "I have simplified politics into an utter detestation of all existing governments." So, if he is only a romantic poet, or a poet with only erotic investments, why should he go to the extent of risking his life with this kind of a comment that he hates all governments basically? So all these actually point to the revolutionary tenets in them. Wordsworth definitely, as the senior most, was a milder person, but the very fact that he changed the topics of his poetry from the Augustan age, and that too radically, wrote poems on very humble people, as I have said, like the leech gatherer. So, and also celebrated liberty in all forms in several of his poems, with direct references to the revolution under consideration also. All this signifies that Wordsworth himself also was heavily influenced by French Revolution, and Coleridge too. It's a profound influence. In fact, they had wayward ways of living. Wordsworth, Coleridge, and some other poets, initially they lived together for some time at the Lake District. So, at every step, overtly or covertly, all the romantic poets, with the possible exception of Keats, but that also is debatable because Keats died very early, all the romantic poets flouted all norms of society. So this itself is the evidence of the influence of French Revolution. Coleridge also, as I have said, he himself was not only a poet but a philosopher and also a political figure and historian, or we can say today a literary critic or even a theoretician at hindsight. And the French Revolution had its share in shaping Coleridge to each of these things. Now, uh, all these indicate as a whole the direct influence of French Revolution on romantic poetry. So I hope, and rather I would rather welcome you to explore more on this. This is only an introductory lecture. I hope as you explore, many things will emerge. Thank you.